And pass the turn.
All right. I will untap. Upkeep, no triggers. Draw. Let me think for a second.
Look at him thinking about his sequencing, counting up his mana. He thinks his decisions matter. Little does he know that I have had this lightning bolt in hand since the beginning of the game. And if he shocks in one more land...
Probably the line. All right. I'm going to play a Temple Garden untapped. Go to 3.
Omae wa mou shinderu.
Nani? Hello, one and all, and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, proprietor of a cabinet of curiosities, Maddox.
I strive to. I don't know if I quite am there yet, but I'll take that.
You've got your house you're trying to fill with things that you love, and you've said a couple times, why buy art when I can buy weird things?
I mean, art is really stuff. It's really hard to find art that is that appeals to me. I don't know how to say that in a nice way. So I'm definitely
every single artist listening is currently offended.
Don't be offended.
Why is my art not good enough for Anthony?
I'm sure it is. I just haven't found it yet. But there are also so many other great things. Cool fossils, cool scientific curiosities, and if I'm honest, that's also kind of the house that I grew up in was a similar vein. So
you've got butterflies and pinned up in nice little frames. You've got gyroscopes. You've got little magnet ball sculptures. And the most recent edition, well, what is the actual term? It's not a computer chip. What is it?
It's a silicon wafer. I wish I understood more. I need to do some more research about this process. But basically, when they're making computer chips, they start with this big silicon crystal, this huge cylindrical ingot, and then slice it into sheets. And then they do sort of like a lithographic etching process of removing material and adding material to sort of build up this microcircuitry that you couldn't do otherwise by just like actually assembling wires together. And it looks awesome.
You just got one of those framed in your house
framed
now.
On the wall, and I love it. I love it so much. It brings me a lot of joy.
So if you have a recommendation for a weird oddity of the natural or technological world that Anthony could put in his house instead of pictures of things,
I will also accept recommendations for great art.
There you go.
Both are allowed.
Anthony, this is our Kamigawa Neon Dynasty community set review. We are reviewing the results of our survey, and you know what that means. We are not alone. On the line, we have Parker Gombach of Lucky Paper Radio, Lamascus.
Thank you. I am glad to be the stable point of this enterprise.
It may sound like an esoteric racial slur, but Gombach is actually a specific 3D shape.
I think it's pronounced like goom boots or something as well.
Yes. I did watch a YouTube video, I thought, to get the pronunciation right. Is it not Gombach? What is it? Maybe the YouTube video I watched, the person was also pronouncing it wrong.
Goom boots.
You should look up this shape, people. It's wild. It's got interesting traits that you might not expect from a 3D shape and didn't know were possible.
It's interesting in a way that you would be like, I didn't even think that would be a thing about a shape. It's
right.
Like, why is this important, and why doesn't a simpler shape do this?
Yeah, it's weirdly specific given its attributes. Very strange. Anyway, welcome, Parker. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be back.
How are things up there in Philadelphia?
It's pretty good. I actually just got done with a day of etching silicon wafers. So,
Seriously?
Yeah, my team does a lot of that kind of work.
Well, then you can actually explain how this works. Like, forget talking about Kamigawa. Let's talk about actual computer chips.
I was about to say,
forget the reality chip.
We have that kind of, unspoken, way the show works where like Anthony and I talk for a tiny bit, then we bring in the guest. But you should have absolutely interrupted us. And we were like, how do silicon chips work? And you're like, I did that all day today. You should just, pop right in and mansplain that to us.
Well, I try to avoid mansplaining wherever possible. So we'll have to say
I don't think it counts as mansplaining if you're asked and you're actually an expert in the subject.
We're actually idiots about it, yeah. Then it's actual just normal explaining.
Well, I will just have to save that for another episode.
Yeah, as much as I would love to talk about the inner workings of silicon wafers, we got a lot on our plate because, as I mentioned, we are reviewing the results of our community survey from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. This set has generated a lot of excitement, not just for Cube, but also for Retail Limited. I've seen a lot of people talking about how this is one of the most fun sets they've drafted in a long time. I saw that Mark Rosewater got the most positive feedback about any set ever since starting his Blogatog blog, which was a decade plus ago. So I think people are really enjoying this set, and I think it's got a lot of cool gems in there for Cube designers of all stripes. Before we dive in, Parker, do you mind explaining the overall structure of the survey that we are reviewing the results from on tonight's podcast, for those who do not know?
Absolutely. So for every set since Throne of Eldraine, we release a survey and we ask Cube curators to tell us what cards they're testing and to rate those cards on a scale of 1 to 3. 3 being highly likely to stay in their cube long-term, and 1 being unlikely to stay in their cube long-term, and a spectrum in between. Now, this is a subjective ranking. So you could assign a card a 1 just because you think it's got ugly art or because you think it's too powerful for your list.
I've done both. I have given cards low scores for both reasons before.
Yes, me too. Conversely, you can give something a 3 just because you think it's beautiful, even if you know it's going to be on the weaker end for your cube. So this is really encoding designers' attitudes towards cards instead of any sort of objective, measure of power level or strength or, what we might import from a constructed mindset.
Right. So it's really just a measure of that subjective personal preference, which takes into account all these other factors that we're talking about.
Yeah,
absolutely. For those of you listeners that have filled out the survey, you will know, but there is no question on the survey, how powerful do you think this card is? That's not something we ask. And I know from looking at the numbers that a surprisingly small percentage of you actually fill out this survey. So if you're out there and you don't fill out the survey, maybe you let me know why this week. I'm curious to know if we can make it easier. Do we have a lot of listeners that don't even design cubes? Is that possible? It is possible, maybe. I don't know. We'll find out.
That'd be cool.
We're going to review in reverse order the most popular cards in the set across cubes of all types. This is inclusive of all the cubes we've had submitted, and that includes pauper cubes, peasant cubes, cubes with absolutely no restrictions, cubes with very specific restrictions, like all the card names have to be alliterative. So this is just inclusive of everybody, and I think it captures a broad picture of the cards people are most excited about for the set. And we're going to do the top 16 on this episode. We always have to kind of pick a somewhat arbitrary place to draw the line where we're going to stop talking about cards, and we chose 16 for this particular one. But if you want to see the full results, and I highly recommend you do check it out, you can go to our website, luckypaper.co, or linked in the show notes, you will find the article that will have the full results as well as more in-depth analysis. One last thing before we dive into the individual cards. Parker, you've looked at the numbers a little bit. Do you have any overall thoughts about the responses in aggregate for this set and just in general how cube designers are feeling about Kamigawa Neon Dynasty?
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts. So when I first started crunching the numbers for Neon Dynasty, I looked at the median designer and how many cards that designer is testing, which is the result for that is that the median designer is testing 12 cards from Neon Dynasty. 12 is very close to Innistrad Midnight Hunt, to Zendikar Rising. These are historically record-setting sets in terms of our survey for how many cards people have tested and how highly they've rated cards. So I saw that first number and I was like, whoa, this is another, gangbuster set for Cube. People are going to be rating a lot of cards really highly. And then I looked at the ranks that our respondents gave Neon Dynasty's cards. And I saw that the median cube designer, again, only gave 2 cards at the median a rank of 2.5 or better. So in other words, they only think 2 cards are going to stay in their list long-term, a fairly done deal. And that's half as many as we saw for Innistrad Midnight Hunt and for Zendikar Rising. And so there's this disconnect between people testing a lot of cards, but they're ranking them relatively low relative to sets that have been successful in the past. So this might just be an artifact of our survey. Maybe a different group of people is responding than responded back last September for Midnight Hunt. Or maybe it's the same people, but their opinions and their tastes in Magic are changing and they're getting more pessimistic as, the pandemic wears on and on and on. However, if we take the numbers at face value and, assume that there's not an artifact in the way we collected the data, it looks like Neon Dynasty is offering a lot of maybe niche cards on one hand that are only appealing to a smaller subset of cube designers, or the effects are so novel or hard to kind of grok that people are being a little more conservative with their rankings.
Parker, I think there are a lot of artifacts in our data because this set has an artifact theme. So I'm looking at the top cards here and seeing quite a few artifacts.
Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. Yes, I mean, at first blush, it seems like people are testing a lot of cards, but are somewhat tepid on how confident they are those cards are going to remain in their cube for the long haul. And I agree. I think it's a combination of people actually having different evaluations of these particular cards because maybe these mechanics are somewhat novel and hard to understand or predict how they're going to play. I do also think, I mentioned on our episode last week that I personally, after reviewing the retrospective article that you and Anthony worked on, lowered my average ratings for all the cards I submitted because I've noticed in the past I tend to be a little bit optimistic with my ratings. Maybe some other people went on a similar journey and realized, like, actually, now that I've got these 2 years worth of Cube surveys to look back on, I realize I'm being a little bit optimistic about how likely a card is to stick around. And so I rated cards more lowly this time, and I'm testing fewer than I normally would. So that could also be a factor. It could be a lot of things.
So I was actually really surprised when looking at the list. I feel like I've gotten a little bit of an intuition for the kinds of cards that we see floating to the top. It's very often cheap cards that are sort of known quantities. They function similar to cards that people are already used to and enjoy.
We got at least one of those.
And right cards that are extremely powerful. So that's the kind of things that I usually expect to see there. And while we do see some things like that, there's also some cards that really surprised me. So I'm really excited to dive in and talk about some of those sort of weird ones.
The 16th most popular card from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is Kaito Shizuki. This is the blue-black Planeswalker. It is 1 blue-black for a Planeswalker with starting loyalty 3. It has a static ability that says at the beginning of your end step, if Kaito Shizuki entered the battlefield this turn, it phases out. Then it has a +1 loyalty ability, draw a card, then discard a card unless you attacked this turn. A -2 loyalty ability to create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can't be blocked. And then, a big -7. I don't read all the rules text of that big long ultimate. It's got an ultimate that's really good that, you could work towards. But, the main two abilities here are the +1 to draw a card or loot, depending on whether or not you've attacked, and the -2 to make a 1/1 ninja token. Definitely a couple of novel things about this card. We see low mana value Planeswalkers, efficient to cast Planeswalkers, often have a lot of potential power level. And here, this phasing out ability is an interesting way to kind of guarantee that almost all of the time you're going to get 2 activations out of Kaito Shizuki, because the turn you play it, it's going to phase out and be unable to be attacked until the next turn, which is also something that is kind of new on Planeswalkers. Parker, are you testing this card in your cube?
I am, and I actually was lucky enough to open one at pre-release, and so I've played a little bit of it already. And I really enjoy these play patterns. So, blue-black is, if we normally think about those color strengths, Mire is very good at being controlling, killing stuff, playing this like destructive, reactive gameplay style. And I love that Kaito incentivizes a very different play style of attacking, playing to the board to protect this Planeswalker, and playing that kind of tempo-based game, which is just a different space. And I love the option to incentivize that in my cube list.
What do you think of this Planeswalker, Anthony?
I have not looked at the Planeswalkers in super detail because in a lot of the environments that I'm running, that's just not generally something that I'm looking at.
Did you have to play against it at pre-release?
I did not, fortunately, have to get to play against it in pre-release.
I did get to play against it at pre-release, and I'm going to take a little moment here to have a little mini session of brags and bad beats.
Reveling in victory, that's brags. Drowning in defeat, that's beats. I'll tell you all about it on brags and bad beats.
I ended up going 4-0, 8-0 at pre-release. My deck was really good.
Wow, bad beat.
This is the
other guy.
This is the brag side. And my deck wasn't really good on the back of like incredible bombs, right? Like the best card of my deck was the reality chip, which is very good. I'm not going to say it's not a bomb, but it's not the kind of card that just, it is kind of the card that just takes over the game. But in reality, I only had one of my 8 games that I really won on the back of the reality chip. Mostly I just won with very like value-oriented uncommons, pretty much. I wasn't winning with these big bombs that people get in their seal pools. And I did come up against a Kaito Shizuki. What I don't love about this card in terms of play patterns, I agree with you, Parker, that it's very cool for cube designers that now they have access to a blue-black Planeswalker that has very different tensions and very different things it's pushing you to do in your deck rather than a typical controlling blue-black Planeswalker. I will say that I like the controlling Planeswalkers in all colors, not just in blue-black. I like Planeswalkers that have some kind of more interactive ability. And here, the closest you get to interaction here is encouraging attacking a little more by allowing you to draw a card instead of loot, and making 1/1s which can't be blocked, which are mostly probably going to be attacking and probably rarely going to be on the blocking side of things. So I think this card is definitely powerful. It didn't tick any of the boxes I was looking for in my own cube, but I totally see what you're getting at in terms of adding different motivations and goals for the blue-black deck to protect a Planeswalker like this.
One thing I do really like about this compared to, or I should say, one of the reasons I don't love Planeswalkers, or I mean, they're fun. I'll play with a Planeswalker, but they're not my favorite card type because they often are just generically powerful and they kind of snowball. So I really like seeing this different direction of Planeswalker design where they motivate playing in a different way. They motivate building your deck in a different way. And, it makes them more narrow, but I think that actually is a positive overall to give us more variety of game pieces to play with as we're designing cubes.
Definitely a positive for cube design in a broad sense because now you have a different kind of Planeswalker, right? I think if you look at Planeswalker design in the first 2 or 3 years Planeswalkers existed versus now, we see a lot more of this, a lot more of a Planeswalker that really only works in a particular kind of deck. Like, you're not going to just jam Kaito Shizuki in a blue-black control deck with very few creatures and be happy. It's pretty rough there. Probably rather just have... Frankly, you might just rather have divination. I don't know, maybe a hot take, but it's not doing a lot in that particular environment. And I'm glad that they're exploring that design space that gives players more options for Planeswalkers that do require you to commit to them in some way instead of just having some Gideon Ally of Zendikar or Garruk Wildspeaker generic value engine that is self-supporting and can snowball out of control all on its own.
Yeah, and I want to push back a little bit, Andy, about the idea that this is not as interactive as you wanted. I think Planeswalkers tend to incentivize interaction because, Kaito only incentivizes attacking, not blocking, like you said. But if you want to keep Kaito around, if you want to maximize the value of that game piece, then you have to block because your opponent will try to attack him and get him off the board. But the resources Kaito gives you only do the attacking bit, or mostly do the attacking bit. So I think there's some tension there and some interactivity that's going to change from game to game based on who's the beatdown is kind of the greater metric that Kaito is operating in. And I think, although my experience with Kaito is limited, I think it's been a really interactive game piece so far.
Yeah, it definitely changes the board assessment. I guess maybe a better way to describe the feeling I had about it is that, when you have a Planeswalker that has a minus ability that does the damage to something or can, possibly remove something or tap it down or some kind of ability that interacts with your opponent's permanence, then oftentimes that one loyalty ability conceals a lot of potential decisions. Like, here's this ability, what am I going to tap down? What am I going to remove? And it means that the range of what the Planeswalker can do is a lot wider. In Kaito's case, it kind of does the two things, and those two things are kind of the same no matter what the board say it is, and you might do them in different combinations depending on what's going on. I agree. I think it offers more decisions for your opponent than for you. And I would say that when I played against it, I did play against it twice at pre-release. I ignored it completely both times. I was like, if you want to pay 3 mana for a 1/1 every other turn and, some looting, that's fine. But in all the cases, my opponents were on the back foot, and I was just like, I'm ignoring that. I'm going to kill you instead. And I think that was the right decision for the games I was playing in, but that's, always going to be context dependent. Anyway, none of that to discourage anybody that wants to play this card, and we should read the numbers. We have about 21% of our testers are trying out Kaito Shizuki, and with an overall high rating of 2.3, a pretty high rating for a card only being tested by 21% of the respondents. The results seem to suggest that people know if they want this card for their environment, and if they do, they're adding it.
In 15th place by popularity, we have Spirited Companion, which is 1 and a white for an enchantment creature dog. It's a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. It's tested by 22% of our respondents with a rank of 2.1. So we have a variant on, Elvish Visionary that has some marginal upside in its type line and also is a color-shifted effect, which we know can often be more powerful than it reads. I've played a lot of this in Limited already and enjoy the play patterns of getting a creature that you don't mind trading, you don't mind attacking, and since you're white, you already want to be getting into combat. So I've quite enjoyed playing with Spirited Companion.
Sorry, did you say this was an upgrade on the type line?
Yeah, because it's an enchantment.
Okay, so I was thinking first about the dog part. I thought you were saying, I agree I like dogs more than elves, but elves are classically one of the most supported and popular tribes in the game.
Yeah, we should say side grade, I guess.
I think the fact that it's an enchantment is actually really interesting. In a lot of ways, I think it's actually a downside because it's more vulnerable to enchantment removal, but specifically on this tiny card, like if we're saying adding enchantment to a 5-drop creature, that definitely means it's more likely to be able to hit a disenchant, but nobody's going to be killing your one with a disenchant. So I don't think
you're probably doing pretty good.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think that's a
or
downside
really
here.
bad.
What I do think it does is, I think one of the challenges if you're doing sort of an enchantment theme is getting a lot of enchantments in your deck and getting them in play at once. So having a cheap way that, without costing you a card, gets another enchantment in play, I think that actually fits perfectly in decks that specifically, or in environments that specifically care about enchantments.
Absolutely.
Outside of that, as a game piece, I think it is a little bit of a downside, though, just because it's more complexity that isn't really necessary.
It definitely depends on the environment. If your environment cares about enchantments, then it is very relevant. I feel like some cube designers have been asking for a white Elvish Visionary for a long time, and now they've got it. I gotta say, this card for me really highlights just how much I love Thraben Inspector, because I'm not interested in testing this card. It didn't jump off the page at me. I agree this effect in my cube specifically is a lot better in white than it is in green, but the ability for Thraben Inspector to do all those other things, like the fact that it's got 2 toughness so it can block tokens, the fact that it makes an artifact for artifact matter stuff, and on the baseline, if you do just want to draw the card, it's only 1 more mana, right? Like if you're just cycling because you're top decking, it's only 1 more mana to play the Thraben Inspector and crack the clue, and you're left behind with a better body. It really highlights how I think that card is a very successful design that does a lot of things. And I think this is in a similar space, but narrower for sure. Like if I don't care about enchantments, I'm definitely not looking at this card. If I do care about enchantments, then I'm already all of a sudden very excited about it. Even though it's got a very generic set of rules text, I think that enchantment type line really, to me, defines what the card does. And I think it's going to be an all-star in cubes that care about enchantments, and probably filler level, replacement level in cubes that don't care about enchantments, because there's a lot of opportunities for interesting white 2-drops regardless of your power level. It's a good boy, though.
Such a good boy. All right, next up at number 14, we have a Containment Construct. This is 2 generic mana for an artifact creature. It's a 2/1. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you may play that card this turn. So this is definitely up there in terms of cards that I am really surprised to see tested by this many people. Like, it's a cool, exciting piece of text.
It's very exciting.
But it seems pretty narrow to me.
I don't know how narrow it is. I certainly think that people are primarily going to think of this as a like engine for their own looting effects or whatever. I think in that case, it's very good. It's also got a fine, like a generic 2-mana 2/1 is like not the worst in a lot of environments. I know that sounds silly, but like that upside, you have to compare the like base rate of the card versus how good the upside is and how many times the upside is going to matter. And I think this upside is probably not going to matter that much in most cube environments. Like in your average game, I don't know, like maybe like 5 or 10% of the time you're ever going to discard a card in like a cube like mine or yours, when you're doing this, unless you have a really dedicated discard theme. But when that upside matters, it's going to really, really matter. It's going to, basically completely negate the downside of a spell and turn some spells into like being kind of broken. I think people are testing it because it is exciting, like you said. It's got a really exciting line of rules text we have not seen on a card before. Really, we've never seen anything even close to this on a card before. I'm trying to think of other cards that do anything similar to this and really drawing a blank.
Bag of Holding?
No, Bag of Holding does not do it. I'm sorry. I guess that's kind of close. The fact that that's one of the closest ones really highlights how this is kind of a unique set of rules text. And I think that's why people are going to be testing, is because it's like, well, this is a new set of rules text. What's this going to do? Let's find out.
And it even has a very high rating, 2.3, which is pretty good. So people aren't just throwing this in to see what it is. They're kind of think it's going to be great.
I hate to burst your bubble, Andy, but Conspiracy Theorist is very similar to Containment Construct. I haven't ever cast this card, but yeah, it's similar. And I think part of the appeal of Containment Construct is its color identity, or its lack thereof. So cube curators who are looking to support specific synergies, maybe like Madness adjacent synergies, they have access to Conspiracy Theorists, but maybe they're singleton and they're only playing 1. Or maybe they prefer to have their discard matters centered in black instead of red. Containment Construct gives the designer a lot of flexibility in how they choose to implement that synergy. And I think that might be one reason why it's seeing a lot of play despite, the Goblin Piker stat line.
I think that's a great point. The fact that it is sort of narrow, but it still fits into a lot of different contexts. You could be doing this sort of low-powered Madness themed deck with or cube with a lot of looting and effects like that. it fits there. It fits into contexts where you might be doing really broken stuff, like casting Lion's Eye Diamond and discarding your hand and doing Storm. So I see why maybe it's not just that there is a large group of people that is interested in it, but multiple different groups of people that are interested in it for different reasons. And yeah, the fact that it's just easy to include in decks means it doesn't take a lot of hits for that.
I did say when we were talking about it last week that I'm one of these testers, one of these 22.4% of people in the Degenerate Microcube. And I said I was putting it in. I gave it like a 1 or 1.5 or something. I was kind of skeptical, but I was putting it in specifically to see if people broke it in Eternal formats. And sure enough, since we last recorded, there have been screenshots of some Legacy decks, Legacy Bomberman decks specifically, that are playing this in combination with LED to do some kind of rude stuff. So
it seems like a rude combo.
Yeah, so it could totally be a thing. Our next card is the first channel land we are talking about. It is worth noting that the red channel land did not make it into the top 16. That's the Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. I'm going to say this one wrong now, too. The one that did make it in is our number 13 card is Takenuma Abandoned Mire. Again, this is the legendary land. It's got channel for 3 and a black, discard Takenuma Abandoned Mire, mill 3 cards, then return a creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control, and it taps for black mana, coming to play untapped. This is a cycle that generally Cube designers, I think, are very excited about. This particular card is being tested by 23.6% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. I've talked about this card with Anthony. I'm curious to know what you think about this card, Parker.
It's certainly relatively popular among Neon Dynasty. You know, if we compare that to some of the most popular cards from Midnight Hunt, I keep going back to, or even like Modern Horizons or Zendikar Rising, I don't think a rank of 2.2 is like too much to write home about, which, you know, I don't really have a point there except to say this might just be a little bit of a relative effect because we're looking at a set that has overall low ratings compared to our expectations. That said, I love this card personally. I love the gameplay of not getting mana screwed because you have a land that enters untapped. But then in the late game, when you're getting mana flooded, you have an out. And
just draw another copy of your best planeswalker or creature.
It's great. It makes me as a player feel like I have agency during my games. And I really like, as a designer, giving my players that feeling. Mostly me. I like to give myself as a player that feeling, honestly.
This is one of my favorites from the set. I think the perhaps relatively low rating and testing percentage is largely due to the fact that a lot of Cube designers still are not particularly excited by putting utility lands in their cube. These cards that take up a slot in their 360 or 540 cards or whatever, and may not add, and then I end up taking up a land slot in the draft. Like if someone looks at this and feels like, well, 95% of the time I'm just playing this as a swamp, then they might consider that to be not worth the slot in their cube, as it were. I'm not among those players, so I'm not the best person to speak to them, because I'm with you, Parker. I love this card. I think it's my second favorite of this entire cycle after mulling it over a little more. And I'm solidly going to be happy to replace Agadeem's Awakening with this card, because Awakening is a much more narrow card with a similar kind of place in this utility land, black utility land arena. So I'm thrilled about this one. And I got to say, too, the showcase art is especially good on this one. It's so good looking.
Stunning, yeah. In 12th place, we have Otawara Soaring City. This is a legendary land that taps for a blue mana, and it has channel for 3 and a blue. Discard Otawara. You can return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. It costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. It's tested by a quarter of our respondents with an average rank of 2.2. So it's similar in some regards to Takenuma, which we just discussed. I like all of the same general things about this card. I like that it offers kind of that mana war utility where you can even return your own things. And I did that in a retail draft yesterday. I returned.
Nice.
Yeah, I set up a little loop with Boseiju Reaches Skyward.
That's the saga?
Yeah, it's the one that returns a land from your graveyard to the top of your library. So I set up a little loop with that, got every forest out of my deck, and it was a good feeling. So, there's this like additional axis of interaction with your opponent, but then also sometimes you get to feel smart and interact with your own things, loop things, and that can be a good feeling.
I really appreciate that about this card. I feel like we've seen increasingly the sort of design team move towards having things only bounce your opponent's things, which makes a lot of sense, especially for digital Magic, and sort of explains what the purpose of the card is, I think, for newer players more. But it takes away a little bit of the flexibility and some of the most exciting moments, when you actually get to use things in like a little bit of an unconventional way. So I really value that they switched that back here.
Yeah, it's a good example of a thing where it's the long tail, right? Like,
but the long tail is where the exciting stuff
right,
is.
Exactly. I would say, like, I would wager probably, maybe 10% of the time your Mana War is bouncing one of your own things as opposed to your opponent's things, if we look at Magic as a whole across the broad spectrum of Mana Wars that are cast. But that 10% of the times is when it's doing something really exciting, right? Like, if you're bouncing your own thing, something very cool is probably happening. Otherwise, you'd be bouncing your opponent's thing. I will say that from a strict play pattern perspective, this card is not as exciting to me as a lot of the other channel lands, and the reason is because, as you described, Parker, I like these lands as lands when you need lands, and if you are flooded and have additional mana, letting them do something else is the play pattern where I like that second mode. And when I think about bouncing things, I'm most excited about bouncing things in very tight board states, in very specific moments of the game where that bounce is very relevant. I'm not as excited to just draw a bounce spell off the top when I have extra mana, because that bounce spell is often just going to basically be buying myself a little bit of time, giving me one more draw before I'm facing down that big threat again. Maybe I get to rebuy one of my own things, and that's probably where I'm most excited about it. But compare that to Takenuma, which is just drawing me the best thing it's died this entire game again, and I'm much more excited about that prospect in a situation where I'm top decking than just bouncing something. And that is, to be clear, not a power level evaluation. I think there's many times where having a bounce spell stapled to a untapped blue land is extremely powerful, and for people that are pursuing power maximized environments, that's going to be very appealing to them. I don't think it's going to fit the kinds of play patterns I'm most excited for these kinds of utility lands to occupy.
It is really interesting to think about these from a power level perspective, because they take up a weird spot where individually they might not be the most powerful cards. It's not like, oh yeah, this is as strong as Oko, Thief of Crowns. But,
you mean in terms of raw impact on the game?
Right, exactly. But in terms of the cost for inclusion in your deck building, these are almost, in a way, infinitely powerful, because it gives you a spell for basically zero cost, because you're just replacing them with a basic. The cost is taking them in the draft. So from a cube design perspective, it is weird to balance, are you just trying to get... Are people interested in playing with more powerful cards, or are they more interested in getting more power into individual decks? Or, obviously they don't have to be doing either of those, but a lot of people I think are.
Yeah, from a constructed perspective, I don't love cards like this that are kind of almost strip upgrades over basic lands.
Yeah, I agree.
I remember when I first started playing Magic and I was looking at some constructed deck lists, and I couldn't figure out why. Is Miko Koro the blue untapped one from original Kamigawa?
Or Oboro?
Oboro, that's the one. I couldn't understand why there were some constructed decks that were playing one copy of Oboro with no... I forget what Oboro does exactly, but whatever...
It bounces itself.
But whatever it does was clearly not being taken advantage of by the deck, and it turned out it was because these people were sideboard teching against, Boyle in whatever format Boyle was played in, and I was just that doesn't spark joy for me, a new Magic player. So I think these designs are dangerous and treading there's a very narrow design space here for cards that are almost better than basic lands in constructed Magic, but I love them in drafted Magic. They're some of the cards that I think have the highest delta in terms of how highly players take them, and as I've said before, I really like including cards that are contentious in my cube, where players dramatically disagree on their value in the draft. I just think they're a great spot for a drafted limited environment, because they offer you this interesting question of how much is this worth in the draft, given that once it's in your deck, it's kind of a free ride.
I should also emphasize, we're saying these are a little bit lower rated than maybe we expected. They are still all at the top in terms of both the number of testers and the ratings that people gave them. But if we compare that to the split lands, like you mentioned, Agadeem's Awakening, from Zendikar Rising, those were largely tested by 40% of the people that responded. So even if they fell sort of similarly, maybe a little bit higher in terms of the overall ranking, just the number of people that were interested in those was so many. I wonder if a lot of that is just because we have more options now. So
Absolutely.
Are people interested in just now comparing, do I want my one black utility land to be one of these two options now, whereas they were much more unique when they were in Zendikar Rising. Another possibility is maybe those, just because of the double-faced nature, looked more like spells first, and the land made the modality more obvious. Additionally, those were also just much splashier effects, so I could see all of these having a little bit of an impact.
I think the density of these kinds of effects, the utility on untapped lands, is the big one. I mean, Zendikar Rising, I remember like being pretty flabbergasted when I saw those cards for the first time and being like, these come into play untapped. I mean, granted, it costs 3 damage, but
some life.
You know, they come into play untapped, they produce color, and they have these like really splashy spells on them. Like that was really exciting to me, and I felt like it was a thing we hadn't seen in a long time. Then, since then, we've gotten the creature lands from Adventure in the Forgotten Realms, which come into play untapped very often and can be animated into relevant creatures. And now this, as a third cycle of cards that occupy a similar space. I think that there's just there's a lot more options now, and players are either more conscious of what that means to them in their cube design, where when they first saw those ones from Zendikar Rising, it was like, well, I got to try this at least, right? Like, I got to see what this feels like. I think maybe players either know better now, like what they actually want in their cube, or those slots are already taken up. Those, slots. I hate talking in terms of slots for cubes, but it is the way people think. Those slots are kind of occupied by other effects.
That's a great point, that somebody might have actually, it's not so much that these cards are competing with previous iterations. It might be that people tried them, said they didn't spark joy, and so now they just know that they're not interested in that kind of effect.
Yeah.
This is a good little case study in why I've lowered my overall ratings, because I rated Aghanim's Awakening pretty highly, and now I'm cutting it for Takenuma, because when I saw Aghanim's Awakening, I was like, we don't get these kinds of cards ever. We never get cards that can come into play on tap, produce colored mana, and have this other utility attached to them. I was wrong. we got a bunch more.
Lesson. The next time you see a card and you think this is something that's brand new and we never get and is extremely unique, it might not be unique for very long. The next card we have up is Touch the Spirit Realm. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment. When Touch the Spirit Realm enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature until Touch the Spirit Realm leaves the battlefield. So it's similar to an Oblivion Ring. It also has Channel for 1 and a white. Discard Touch the Spirit Realm, exile target artifact or creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. We talked about this a little bit previously. I'm really excited about it. I think Oblivion Rings are a very cool card type. I also like blinking things, so actually being able to include a blink spell with a much lower cost of inclusion in the deck is kind of exciting to me.
Yeah, I think cube designers broadly agree, and having access to this effect without having to commit a whole card to it is very appealing. 26% of our respondents are testing it. We're inching up there in the percentages, and another rating of 2.2, slightly above the middle. A little better than normal, I guess is what we can say 2.2 is.
I am interested in looking at how people are playing this. Are they just interested in over Banishing Light, Oblivion Ring? We've seen a lot of similar effects. Because it has that modality, are they actually cutting those, or are people just interested in having more redundancy for those effects?
Have to look at the comments on the survey and see what people have said.
We're going to have to go snoop in people's cube blogs.
I have read the comments, and I don't think anybody mentioned Touch the Spirit Realm specifically. I just want to throw out there that I think Touch the Spirit Realm is a beautiful, compact design and a story on a card. I think it's really neat that the channel and the base effect do the same thing, but for different durations. And I just think it makes a really neat package. I'm not playing it myself, but it's got a place in the back of my mind for whenever I need to make a cube that's only beautiful designs, because I think it has a obvious place there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I love when it's not just here's the menu, but it is some resonant set of effects that play off of each other.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I had any criticism about channel in this set, is that a lot of the channel designs, I don't really see the connection between the two modes of the card. It's kind of
some
arbitrary.
of them work pretty well. The lands, obviously, because the land aspect is pretty fixed. It's not quite, there's not a lot there.
Yeah. Art is also pretty sick on Touch the Spirit Realm.
Very cool.
That brings us to our top 10. Number 10 most popular card from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is perhaps another one Anthony didn't expect. Maybe I might hazard. It's Lizard Blades. 1 and a red for an artifact creature equipment lizard. It's got double strike. Equipped creature has double strike. It's got reconfigure for 2, and it is a 1/1. We mentioned this in our episode last week about our own cube editions, and this is, as we talked about, I think one of the best, safest, lowest risk ways to give other creatures double strike in Magic's history. And double strike is an exciting ability because it, like so many other abilities, changes a lot depending on what kind of creature you've attacked it to. I know people out there have sugar plums dancing in their head, and they're dreaming of doubling up on their, rattlesnake abilities, doubling up on
ninja abilities.
They're just dreaming of all the things you can do with Lizard Blades. Is this one of the ones you're surprised to see in the top or no?
I'm a little bit surprised. Not as much as some of these others, but it's definitely, it's a little surprising.
Every time I see this card, I am surprised it's a rare. It feels kind of like an uncommon to me, just in terms of complexity and what it does, but I guess it's just too good to be an uncommon?
Yeah, I think it's extremely powerful.
This is another one I just beat all over the place at pre-release of my uncommon pool. This is tested by 26.8% of our testers. Little lower rating, 2.1, but people are still overall pretty excited about Lizard Blades.
Okay, our next card is Eiganjo, Seat of the Empire. It is the white legendary land. It taps to add white, and you can channel it for 2 and a white, discard Eiganjo. It deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. The ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. It's tested by 29.2% of our respondents with a rating of 2.3. Yeah, it's a pretty big jump. Another strong modal effect. It's got the early-late duality there that makes both modes really appealing, and it also offers some interaction with the opponent. It can make combat interesting, so I like that it incentivizes putting your creatures into the red zone, or otherwise taking advantage of the bluffing and combat tricks and removal during the combat step. I think that can be a really fun play pattern.
I've got to say, I am now officially bored of the legendary creature discount on these. I feel like it is probably doing something for the limited environment and the themes there. For cubes, that's just not going to matter. It just is so much extra text.
It will matter in some cubes.
It will
some
come
people
up.
have legendary matters cubes, in which case these cards are disgusting.
You're right. I need to think about those people.
But I agree.
have some very good friends with legendary.
It's true, you do. I agree. On the average case, it's probably not going to matter that much, and it makes the cards just have a lot more text on them. This is probably my favorite of this entire cycle, and I do want to resolve what I would label as a slight logical inconsistency in the arguments, because the argument I made against my liking Otawara was that its channel ability was only situationally valuable. Like, it's very specific moments of the game where I want to be able to bounce a creature, and that's not all moments of the game. I think the same goes for dealing 4 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. That is board state dependent. It's not just going to be always relevant when you're top decking. It's going to depend on what the game has sort of shaken out as. The reason I'm really excited about this card specifically is because I'm trying to push control strategies a little more in my environment. I've pushed aggro really, really hard for years. I love aggro. I've really just kind of shoehorned as much aggro support as I can across the entire color pie in my cube to make people play aggressive and just get games over quickly, get into the red zone. And I think one of the decks that has suffered a little bit is just the controlling decks. And to me, this is like a perfect control card. I'm actually only like medium happy to play this in a proactive deck, because removing a blocker after it's already blocked once is nowhere near as good as removing a blocker proactively, so I can get him for more damage. But in a control deck, having a land that also is just going to be a kill spell is so relevant, and I'm really excited about that. I got a question for both of you. If you've got Eiganjo, you've got Amaria's Call, you've got Cave of the Frost Dragon in your blue-white control deck, let's throw an Otawara in there too. Let's say you've got that. How many lands do you run? Do you start to go back up to 17 lands? Do you go to 18 lands if there's this many spell effects on lands? Just guarantee you never, well, not guarantee, but really strongly discourage any chance that you get mana screwed and in exchange you have all these modal lands?
I think I would generally tend to play them as lands. I don't think that's right, because I think that you're right that you do want to take advantage of that modality and treat them as spells a lot of the time. So I think maybe treating them as somewhere between a third to a half of a land is kind of where you should be.
I typically think about Urza's Saga as a spell, and obviously that's like a extreme example, but when I desperately want to be activating my land in order to get the most value out of it, I'm more likely to treat it as a spell. And I think that's probably most true for Cave of the Frost Dragon and Eiganjo, of the 4 that you mentioned. So I think if I had all 4 of those, I'd be adding 2 extra lands to my deck effectively, going up to 17 or even 18 lands.
That's what I'm thinking too. For me, I think it depends a lot on my deck as well. Like in aggro decks, I'll still play all those cards in an aggro deck. And there, it's purely flood insurance. It's like, if I flood out, I just want to make sure I have something to do with my mana. But there, I'm mostly expecting them to be lands if I draw my deck the way I want to draw my deck.
casting the 7-drop Angel spell is not what you're expecting to do. So
no, but I do put it in my aggro decks, which some people would say is wrong, but I definitely do. And it's there for, the mid-range match where the board just gets too clogged up and you can't attack, but they also have to keep the cards back to block because you've got them down to a low life total. It's there for the aggro mirror that just goes long. It's there for all kinds of reasons, and it's worth it, I think. But there, I'm really 98% of the time, 95% of the time expecting it to be a land, and so I just count it as a land. I think in control decks, for all these cards, I'm much happier to say, I'm hoping to cast this probably. You can definitely build a control deck in my cube now where your win conditions are all lands in blue-white. You have the Angel Making spell, Amiria's Call, you have Creature Land, Celestial Colonnade, Cave of the Frost Dragon. Those can be all your win conditions. And if those are all your win conditions, then I'm really want to be planning to cast Amiria's Call and have it as a land in a pinch if I need it, rather than the other way around. I think it's really interesting. I am so glad we're seeing more of these lands because I mentioned in the Discord today that one thing that irks me a little bit is when players are just like, oh yeah, limited decks have 17 lands, and don't actually think about how many lands their deck wants and what those lands are. They're just 17 is their heuristic, and they just always, live and die by it. As we've talked about in the show, I really tend more towards 15, 16 lands in basically all of my decks, lower if they're super aggro. And with these density of more relevant non-basics that have spell-like modes on them, I'm going to tend higher and just see what it's like to play 18 lands sometimes.
Continuing the channel theme, next up we have Twinshot Sniper. This is 3 in a red for an artifact creature, Goblin Archer. It has reach. When it enters the battlefield, it does 2 damage to any target. It has channel for 1 in a red, discard Twinshot Sniper. It deals 2 damage to any target. It's a 2/3. This is another great example where I feel like the channel ability and the rest of the card really work together, and it sort of tells you a story. You can either just get this twin shot right now, or you get the creature and you get the twin shot along with it. It's a little weird to me that this is an artifact, but for some reason that I'm just more comfortable with artifact creatures than enchantment creatures.
It's funny. It's weird to me it's a goblin. I keep forgetting it's a goblin. It doesn't really look like one in the art to me.
True.
And obviously the frame is an artifact frame, so to me it's it's an artifact. I can tell from looking at it. And I always forget it's actually a goblin. I was like, oh yeah, when you read it, I was like, yeah, you're right, it is that.
This is being tested by 30%, so almost a third of the people that responded to the survey, and it's a pretty high rating of 2.3.
It just occurred to me that the channel ability is the sniping. It's not even on the map, and it's just murking some people from
it's not even
very
in battle.
Far away. Which
I kind of wish the flavor was that either you shot the goblin at the person, and then the goblin was in the graveyard.
You cast fling.
Right. That's a thing in goblins. Goblins do have a history of throwing themselves at other things in Magic, and so the fact that this either comes into play and it's an archer and it shoots something, or you're just I don't have time, just shoot the entire goblin, shoot the entire goblin at the bad guy. That's a fun flavor for me to think about.
I mean, it's got 2 powers, so I buy that.
Yeah, it's a fun design. I will be testing it. I like the idea of turning on Delirium much faster and at instant speed, and it can't be countered. And it also has a kicker of the creature. I won't be expecting to cast the creature as much as the overcosted shock, but I think that's an interesting combination of abilities that will give it a lot of synergistic power.
Yeah, I've seen more and more people interested in Delirium specifically. So this being a removal spell, a burn spell that also puts 2 relevant card types in the graveyard is pretty interesting. And relevant card types that maybe aren't going to get there as quickly if you are also playing this alongside Shock.
My question for you, Parker, is does this card spark joy? I understand the arguments for why it's strong and interesting. It's got these modes. I love modal cards. But do you look at this card and go yes, I can't wait to play that?
I look at that card, think of Tarmogoyf, and then go, yes. So I guess
finally Tarmogoyf is relevant.
I think you're more evolved. I have to get to where you're at, Parker. I'm testing it, and as I said last week, it still doesn't spark that joy for me. I can't picture the deck where I'm drafting and I get a pick 8 or pick 9 Twinshot Sniper, and I'm like, yes, I got there. I wheeled the card I wanted. I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, that's my filler. I'll put it in. It's fine. But maybe I'm wrong. I hope I get to a place where this card feels as good to cast as I think it actually is.
I mean, especially if you're building a lower powered environment where Delirium and other effects that care about the graveyard a lot are important features of the set, this could be a really interesting and sort of staple card.
And the card is really good. This is one of the uncommons that was in my sealed pool that I was beating Kaito Shizuki's and Lizard Blades with, because it's just really, really strong and always relevant. You are always doing something with it. Even the fact that it can just hit face. Like, I had games where my opponents had no creatures in play because I removed them with all my other removal spells. Then I was like, all right, fine, play this as a 2/3 that just deals 2 damage to you. It's always going to be relevant no matter what the board state is.
And it's a combo with Containment Construct, and I've pulled that off, I think, once in Limited already.
Oh, I did so much of that. Parker, my seal pool had 2 Containment Constructs and 2 Patchwork Automatons in it, and I was just like, I'm doing all the artifact channel nonsense I possibly can, and it was powerful. Speaking of which, the number 7 card on our survey is, I think, one of the most contentious and interesting cards of the set. It is Reinforced Ronin. This is 1 red mana for a 2/2 artifact creature human samurai with haste. At the beginning of your end step, return Reinforced Ronin to its owner's hand, and it has channel for 1 and a red, and the channel ability just draws a card. So it's effectively cycling, but in the set with channel, they made it channel instead of cycling. Being tested by 32% of our respondents with an average rank of 2.1, a little more tepid than some of the cards we've been talking about in the past couple, but still up there. Parker, where do you come down on this contentious cube card?
Boy, it's hard to know what to think. I like the play pattern of investing mana into an aggressive threat. Like, I think it's okay to put a little bit of a mana threshold onto this power so that the aggressive player is kind of naturally slowed down by spending their mana over and over. I don't hate that play pattern that it creates in a game. And I also don't hate that it's got the buyout mode for that aggro player if it becomes too much of a liability. And I further don't hate that it's an artifact and you can trigger your Psi Master Thopterist every single turn if that's, how you choose to leverage that value.
Or your 2 Patchwork Automatons every single turn, just saying.
Yes,
this is in my seal pool too.
Yeah, so I think it's a neat package. I'm just not really the right kind of Johnny personally to, have this card spark joy for me personally. So I'm not going to test it, but I do see the appeal.
This is definitely one of the ones that I was really surprised to see this high. I wonder if people just see 1 mana 2/2 haste and they think this is worth a try. It's got some downsides, but we got to at least give it a try. I did go back and look at Wayward Guy Beast
to see how low it was,
which was only tested by about 7% of the respondents to that survey. So that's maybe not a great hypothesis. I think the fact that it is an artifact and it has all those other modes, again, might just mean that it is relevant and interesting to a lot of different contexts.
Here's my take. I think that when we do our retrospective on this set in 18 months or whenever that retrospective is going to be, that this card will have fallen off a lot. I think a lot of these players are not going to stick around with this card because, frankly, I think a lot of them are like me. I put it in my testing list. I gave it a 1. I was like, I don't think this is going to stick around. 1. I gave it a 1, solid 1. I was like, I don't expect this to be in my cube in 9 months, but I have to play it to find out what the heck it does because it is a weird combination of abilities and weird play patterns, and I'm not sure how good it is in all the different modes you could possibly play it. I do think that the people that end up sticking with this card are going to be really happy with it, though. I think in environments where you do care about artifacts, you do care about discarding, you care about card types in graveyard, you care about all these things, and maybe you are not pursuing the most ruthless aggro decks and ruthless control decks. I think in more synergistic environments, this is going to be like a huge all-star. I thought it was going to be good in my seal pool, and it really, really, really overperformed. It was one of the best cards in my deck, bar none, because there were some games where I just had it on my opening hand, and I did 6 or 8 damage to my opponent before they played anything, and that's a pretty disgusting place to start a game, and you're happy to invest that mana in a sealed game. And there were a lot of games where I got a Containment Construct in play, and I was like, now I'm going to draw an extra card every single turn, then I'm going to play this thing, I'm not even going to bother attacking with it because I triggered my 2 Patchwork Automatons, they both got bigger, and I'm just going to do this over and over and over again. It was fun, it was really exciting. A lot of cubes aren't going to have those kinds of synergies, but for the cubes that do, I think it's going to really overperform. Like, if you ignore the fact that it's a 1 mana 2/2 with haste, the fact that it's just this artifact that you can channel and never recur.
How to keep an Izzet Mage busy, but an artifact.
In some environments, it's really close to that. It's going to be really close to that, I think. And those are the environments that are really going to love this card, because then it also has the mode of and also kill your opponent with it. I had a very controlling seal pool that I oftentimes ended games by removing all of my opponent's stuff and chipping away for a little damage here and there. And then I would just play this and the 6/5 boar that has haste in the same turn, and then just attack for lethal. And these things having haste really matters. It still mattered late in the game, even though it was a dinky 2/2.
Do you want to talk more about how your sealed pool had all these great cube cards in it?
Look, it just happened to play out that way. And that's the experience I have playing the card so far, so it's all I got to lean on. But I think it's exciting. I will register a small complaint here. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter like giving people a hard time for adding this card to their cube because they think it's not a good enough red aggro 1-drop. Yeah, shut up. Just shut up. I don't care. Let people curate their cubes. There's all kinds of reasons to play this card that are not that it is just pure beatdown stats. It's got a lot of cool knobs to play with.
Chill MTG's hot take.
There's a lot of hate going around about Reinforced Ronin. But let's think about Reinforced Ronin this way. It is the red cantrip that also puts 2 card types into the graveyard for Delirium. And then, depending on the context of the board state, you can use it to get in for 2 damage or enable additional attack triggers. Plays well with Hellrider. Hot take.
If you think it's not good enough for your cube, just be glad that other people are making cubes with different cards so we have more variety.
Yeah. And I get to play with fun cards like Reinforced Ronin.
I think the thing with the enchantment creatures is the artifact creatures work so much better because they can just be like, here's a creature, we bolted a big robot arm to it, so now it's clearly an artifact creature. And the enchantment creatures are
they just
like,
make them like kind of wispy
here's
or like
Dockside
sparkly.
Chef. It's got some ghosts around it, but is that really part of the creature? I don't know.
Okay, so our next card is the 6th most tested card from Neon Dynasty. And these last 6 cards are in a tier of their own.
Absolutely.
We see that they occupy more than 40% of testers are including these cards, whereas the last one was only 30. So it's a 10% jump at least over the next most popular card. So I think these are really the cream of the crop in terms of Neon Dynasty, and the data seem to support that idea. So in 6th place, we have the Wandering Emperor. 2 white for a legendary planeswalker. It has flash. As long as the Wandering Emperor entered the battlefield this turn, you may activate her loyalty abilities anytime you could cast an instant. And it's got +1, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. It gains first strike until end of turn. -1, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. And -2, exile target tapped creature, you gain 2 life. 3 starting loyalty. So I love the Wandering Emperor. It is the card I'm most looking forward to casting. I love flash spells. I love modality on a planeswalker. Like, my least favorite planeswalkers are the ones where there's one mode that's really obvious. Jace Memory Adept comes to mind, where usually you just 0 to, cut their library size in half roughly. Yeah, I like planeswalkers where, as the controller, I have a lot of options, and my opponent then has counterplay. So since the Wandering Emperor mostly has the most impact during combat, that gives the opponent a lot of chances to activate the abilities of their creatures. Maybe they can untap something at instant speed to blank the -2. Maybe they can use a removal spell to blank the first strike. I think there's a lot of counterplay there. It already occurs, like the Wandering Emperor can be cast during the most interactive phase of a turn, which is combat. So I love the play patterns this incentivizes. I love the art. I love everything about it. So I'm very excited for the Wandering Emperor.
I agree with everything you said, and people have heard me talk about this card if you listened to the episode last week, so I won't reiterate that too much. I do want to say that the other thing I thought of when I was editing the episode, which I always do, is I mentioned that one of the floors was very often, pretty much no matter what your opponent's got going on, you get to make 2 2/2s with Vigilance and have a Planeswalker left over. The alternative, which I think is going to be very relevant in a lot of board states, is make a 3/3 with Vigilance that gets to attack as a first striker with Vigilance and then still be back blocking, which is just a really strong way to protect a Planeswalker like this. I know we don't spend a ton of time talking about raw power level evaluations, but I have to get your take on this, Parker. Where do you think the Wandering Emperor in raw power level, which I know is hard because it's always context dependent, but where do you think it roughly ranks amongst the other 4-mana white Planeswalkers?
Okay, well, I am a sellout for Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. I think she's the most powerful in my environment. And then I also hate Gideon's Face, like you. So,
hooray!
And it's powerful enough, but boy, those 2/2 night tokens have started to age poorly in in my format, especially where I have a lot of 1 mana 2/3s that just, really negate a lot of Gideon's value.
In your environment, making a 3/3 might be way more relevant than making 2 2/2s.
Absolutely. And getting first strike at instant speed can also really provide a meaningful step up in a creature's size and ability to brawl in combat. So I think the Wandering Emperor will have no problem hanging in my environment. And I'm so impressed by her play patterns that if I thought Gideon was better, I don't. But I would still cut him because I prefer the Wandering Emperor's play patterns by such a wide margin.
Heck yeah. Heck off, Gideon.
That's right. Get out of town.
So it's really fun to look at this card and think about how great it's going to feel to cast it and how powerful and how you get so much advantage from the flash. How terrible is it going to feel to have this cast against you?
A very important question to ask, I think, Anthony. And pretty bad, I think.
I think it's going to feel pretty bad.
Pretty bad, but in ways that I'm surprised would specifically jump out at you because you love doing tricky stuff in combat. This is just tricky stuff in combat, the Planeswalker.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
To me, I think in my environment, it's going to be pretty substantially broadcast if you
that's a really good
leave
point.
4 open mana going into your opponent's combat step in a lot of decks. I think it's going to offer interesting meta counterplay where first main phasing threats that you think your opponent might be calling up a counterspell for is going to be very real because it will tell you whether or not you can attack without fear of the Wandering Emperor. Probably not that detailed.
Fear the Wandering Emperor.
Probably not that much detail until after you've already seen it, but in game 2 or 3, certainly, I will consider first main phasing spells because I want to limit my opponent's options in combat. Or vice versa, you could intentionally go into combat, maybe throw away a creature, really give them a tempting place to cast the Wandering Emperor because you really want to resolve something big in the second main phase. To me, I think it's going to be good to play against, but not in a way that I think is going to be tilting. 4 mana is a lot for a spell in at least my environment, so you should get a big payoff. And I think this is an appropriately sized payoff for the investment you're making.
And there's a lot of counterplay too. All of her abilities require you to be interacting with or using creatures. And those are the easiest type of card to interact with, to kill outside of combat. So I think that an opponent, even if they get hosed in game 1, can sideboard or play differently to kind of reduce those feel bads in games 2 and 3.
The other thing I want to mention about the Wandering Emperor, which we haven't said in this episode or our prior episode, is that one of the very few planeswalkers at this low mana cost that comes into play with 3 very relevant abilities you can activate any one you choose. That's one of the things I really love about Elspeth Sun's Nemesis. 3 loyalty ability options that are all very reasonable, and there are circumstances where you can imagine wanting all of them. And Wandering Emperor is very similar, where it's just you've got 3 options, and a lot of those options involve making choices. Not only do you have the option of choosing these loyalty abilities, but then you get to choose which of your creatures do you put the +1/+1 counter on, which of your opponent's tap creatures do you actually exile. A lot of stuff going on here to like.
Yeah, I'm just actually thinking through the decision tree. If we said there's a couple creatures on each player's board, the decision tree gets really complicated. You can cast this at any time in the turn, any time in the 2 turns, and activate any of these abilities and target any kinds of stuff.
Do you cast it in combat to prevent taking some damage by either making a token and trading or by exiling something, or do you instead hold up your mana so you can hold up a counterspell for their second main phase, cast it on end step, then exile an attacker, and take that damage in exchange for having that counterspell up? I think it's going to be a beautiful unfolding panoply of options that I'm excited to navigate.
Next up, at number 5, we have Rabbit Battery. This costs a single red mana. It's an artifact creature, Equipment Rabbit. Love to say Equipment Rabbit. It has haste. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has haste, and has a reconfigure for 1 in a red. So you can attach that and grant the +1/+1 and haste to another one of your creatures, or just unattach it from your creature.
I am pleasantly surprised that Rabbit Battery is this high on the results. Number 5 overall card from Neon Dynasty. I did not expect it to be there.
I'm not quite as surprised because it does fall into sort of it ticks all those boxes that we described of being cheap in terms of mana cost, sort of a known quantity.
I don't think it's a known quantity. That's where I disagree.
Really?
What other card that people play a lot in Cube do you think this is comparable to?
Any very efficient creature with haste at 1 mana. It's
not efficient. It's a 1 mana 1/1. People don't play Raging Goblin. If everyone was cubing Raging Goblin, I'd be like, yes, Rabbit Battery is going to be one of the top cards in this set. Most people aren't, for a lot of reasons. I'm surprised Steve is so high because I so often hear the mantra oh, your 1 mana threats have to have 2 power. I myself have been criticized for running 1 mana threats with only 1 power before, and so I expected more people to feel the same way about Rabbit Battery. But for one reason or another, people seem more excited about the trade-off of less power in the initial turns of the game for that flexibility later, which, as I've said before, is something I'm really excited about, and I didn't expect it to be this high. I think a contributing factor is that it is an uncommon, so all of our peasant cube respondents can be playing this card, which is going to push that number up a little bit, and I do think that's probably going to be very popular there, but I'm just excited to see this card this high. I think it's a really cool design.
Yeah, I agree. We talked about this last week. I think Reconfigure is an awesome effect that lets you have an efficient early gameplay that still can be relevant in a longer game as well.
You know, maybe another factor for the popularity of Rabbit Battery could be that people are looking to spice up their aggressive sections. We saw from our retrospective that there's a lot of churn in aggressive creature suites. People tend to test a lot of aggressive creatures and then phase them out as they get boring or as new, more exciting options come up because, well, I don't have a great explanation for why that happens, but we do see it happen pretty clearly. So, you know, maybe this is you're bringing in Rabbit Battery over the options from last year's standard sets just to kind of give an aggressive section a facelift.
Yeah, I think maybe the perception is a lot of those cheap aggressive threats are more fungible. You just swap them out and they all kind of do more or less the same thing. Or maybe people don't feel the same way about 3 and 4 mana cards with more unique rules text on them. But I think this one kind of bucks that trend in that I don't think it's a outside case you're going to be reconfiguring this. I think you're going to reconfigure this in most games you play it, probably. It's going to happen a lot. It's only 1 mana. Unless your curve is super tight and you're using every single mana every single turn, at some point you're going to put this on a Dreadhorde Arcanist, put this on a Krenko Mob Boss,
Krenko Tin Street Kingpin.
Put this on whatever your environment has that cares about power, or just put this on an evasive threat and make it way better than the 1 mana 1/1 it was to start with, in addition to giving yourself a little bit of wrath resistance, because now you've got this equipment that is safe from board wipes and sorcery speed removal when it's equipped to something. So I don't think this is an edge case you're going to reconfigure. I think this is like the main play pattern of the card, is that you are going to very often do that, and sometimes you're just going to get in for 2 or 3 before your opponent plays a blocker, and that'll also be fine.
Yeah, I could see people's enthusiasm coming from that direction maybe a little bit easier. We've seen lots of cards like this, like Boots of Speed and Crystal Slipper, and I mean even Lightning Greaves to a degree, where it's a really appealing effect to say, I'm going to give a bunch of my creatures haste, but the floor on those cards costing a card and not having an impact immediately in a lot of environments is just not relevant, and it's just such a high cost to put an equipment that doesn't really have a meaningful impact on the board in your deck. But here, the reconfigure both meaning that on its face, it is just a creature that can attack and block, and also gives you all those other little outs, you know, like you're saying, the Wrath Protection, the splitting it off after blockers and stuff like that, it makes the card pretty interesting.
Yeah. So the card I really want to compare this to is Falkenrath Pitfighter, which was the 1 mana 2/1 with upside we got from Midnight Hunt. The upside is, I think, one of the better upsides on 1 mana 2/1s, but still nowhere near as often going to come up as the upside on Rabbit Battery. That card was tested by like over 75% of the respondents. It was a set people really liked and had a lot of high-rated cards, but tons and tons of people were testing that card. Much higher percentage than we see testing Rabbit Battery here. Just to like talk out the play patterns, I think a lot of times Rabbit Battery is actually going to have more damage output than a 1 mana 2/1, even when played on turn 1. So hear me out. You play Rabbit Battery with haste, you attack for 1. You play a 2/1 without haste, you attack for nothing. Rabbit Battery currently in the lead. Next turn happens, you can attack with your 2/1, you can attack with your Rabbit Battery. Now they're tied in terms of damage output. What happens next is very environment dependent, but in my own environment, there are tons of cheap creatures in pretty much any deck except for control decks. Even the mid-range decks have lots of 2 mana threats that they're playing, and so you should expect to be staring down a threat, and theoretically a threat that can block a 2/1 profitably. And now the Rabbit Battery, not only, it also doesn't get in the same way that your Falkenrath Pitfighter doesn't get in, but now it can make the next thing you play also have haste and also maybe be able to get in where it couldn't get in otherwise, which I think is a really powerful play pattern. So I think the card is really strong and worth considering for anybody that has any kind of semblance of red aggressive deck. And if your take on it is that like, oh, it's only got 1 power, so it's not good enough, give it a try, because I think it's better than Falkenrath Pitfighter, and that's a card that we saw way more people testing, and I theoretically would belong in similar decks.
this is also not a measurement of the power level of cards. People can just like Rabbit Battery.
Or dislike Rabbit Battery, as it were. Maybe that's true. Maybe people just don't like it, but I don't see why they wouldn't, because it's got way more decisions. I mean,
people, almost half of the people that responded are testing it.
I'm just comparing to the 3/4 of people that responded that were testing Falcon Wrath Pitfighter.
That is the surprising number.
That's a high number.
That's a high number.
Anyway, I think Rabbit Battery is cool. I'm excited to see it this high, though I'm still a tiny bit surprised, it must be said. The next card, number 4, is Blade of the Oni. This is 1 and a black for an artifact creature equipment demon. It is a 3/1 with menace. It gives the equipped creature base power and toughness 5/5 and menace, and is a black demon in addition to its other colors and types. And its reconfigure cost is 2 black.
I love the story that you're telling with this blade, like picking it up and then it corrupts you, and then you decide to drop it and it just starts walking off on its own to eat some souls or like, man, it is just very cool. And it makes me want to turn my Dreadhorde Arcanist into a 5/5 so that I can, exile Cryptic Command from my graveyard. And
now that's a deck
3
right
colors,
there.
But
I want to see that deck.
It's just, yeah, it's the stuff that dreams are made of, or like maybe nightmares, depending on how you feel about demons. But I'm pumped to test this card, and like it blends power and appealing play patterns. You have to be attacking, you have to be committing to the board with creatures, and it also blends that storytelling potential and that ability to create emergent, surprising synergies. So I think it's just a really appealing design.
I'm curious to see how often the reconfigure comes up here, comparing it to Rabbit Battery, which is only 1 mana reconfigure. 4 mana is a big chunk of mana. It's a lot of resources to commit, but the benefit it gives you is really substantial. And so I'm really curious with my own testing to see how often that actually comes up and how often this is just a 2 mana 3/1 with menace, which is a perfectly fine baseline. That's a very interesting, cool body that I'm happy to have in play, because it's going to really force some difficult blocks for your opponent a lot of the time.
Andy, if I had to guess in your format, I'd say the reconfigure is going to be frequently activated because it will let Savannah Lions rumble with Tasigur and your other delve threats that are at the top end of your mid-range decks.
That would be cool. I would like to see that.
That's my guess. I don't know. In 3rd place, we have Boseiju, Who Endures, tested by 49.6% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.6, which is the highest in the survey. Boseiju is the legendary land from green. It taps to add a green. Channel ability is 1 and a green. Discard Boseiju. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land with a basic land type, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So Boseiju already has all of the appealing play patterns that we've mentioned for 3 other cards in this cycle. One appealing factor that we have not talked about explicitly yet is the tension that this land presents in draft. During a pack, you'll have to weigh the relative benefit of a land which has so little downside and a pretty meaningful ceiling versus a spell. And I personally really love those kinds of decisions because it feels a little bit like a push your luck kind of mechanic or feature of the draft. I'm trying to push my luck to get these lands as late as I possibly can while still not giving up on the power that they provide. That's one more reason in this long list of reasons we've already developed of why these legendary lands are appealing.
This is an example of an effect that I still really like in draft, and I'm less thrilled about in constructed, and we don't play constructed, so my opinion doesn't really matter here. But this is the kind of thing where, like, if I'm playing an Artifact Matters deck in some constructed format, and my opponent just gets to free roll 1 or 2 copies of Boseiju in their green deck without having to take up a slot for any kind of artifact interaction, I'm going to be like, cool, great, I'm glad you got to free roll that card. In draft, they have to take it. It's a draft pick, and so you do have to somewhat prioritize having that flexibility, right? Like, I would argue in most Cube environments that are not dedicated artifact and enchantment-based environments, your average naturalize effect is going very, very late. And sometimes it gets sided in, and there's plenty of merit to including cards in your cube that go very late and provide sideboard flexibility. But this, by comparison, I think it's going to be a relatively high pick, and a pick that is going to be, again, contentious. Players are going to disagree on how valuable it is to have access to this kind of sideboard answer effect on a card that is just a land in your deck. And so there, I feel great about the play patterns, and I'm perfectly happy to have it. I think this is scoring higher than the other lands, largely because it's probably the most powerful one for Constructed Magic. And again, a lot of players' perspectives on cards are informed by Constructed Magic. I don't think this is the most exciting one for most cubes, but people seem to be excited about it.
I think it's also the one that has a very situational effect that's very relevant, that maybe you don't want to be, drafting a naturalize and putting it into your deck. So because it has that sort of spread of use cases and offering something sort of unique, I see why people are interested in it. Next up, our number 2 card, which is also the number 2 rated card at 2.5, is Eater of Virtue. It's 1 generic mana for a legendary artifact equipment. Whenever equipped creature dies, exile it. Equipped creature has +2/+0. Now we got a wall of keywords. As long as a card exiled with Eater of Virtue has flying, equipped creature has flying. The same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. And it has Equip 1. I don't know about the order they put all those effects in.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of thought that goes into that, but I think I would have put the Equip cost higher.
And then the power toughness, and then maybe all that stuff. But okay, this is a pretty cool card. A lot of people are excited about it, again, because it's a comparable to a known quantity that is already much beloved. It's sort of a strictly better Bone Splitter is what it is often being called.
Definitely a side grade, I would argue.
Definitely, yeah. The exile is some kind of downside in a lot of decks, but at the same time, you get the huge upside of this card growing and gaining a bunch of abilities, and frankly, just from a design and play perspective, that's really appealing. Like, just having this sword that's soaked up the powers of all of its previous wielders is pretty cool.
I actually do think, in at least my own environment, it is a very solid side grade. I don't think this is notably better than Bone Splitter in my own cube. And there's plenty of decks where you just rather have a Bone Splitter. Like, I could be convinced that if you showed me some 17 lands aggregate win percentage data that Bone Splitter was better, I would concede, sure, maybe it's better than Eater of Virtue. All that said, I'm playing Eater of Virtue because it's so freaking cool. Like, it does really interesting stuff, and it's just a way cooler card, I think, because of all that long tail of potential interactions with other cards in the deck that can create these really cool moments. Parker, you are not on Bone Splitter in your own cube, if memory serves. Is that true?
That is correct, yeah.
Do you feel the same way about Eater of Virtue, that it doesn't fill a niche you're looking to fill?
Yeah, I do. On the other hand, it's cool, and it's got
this
a
is
nice
the important tension.
Art.
This is what people need to hear about. Like, it's got cool art, it's a cool card, but otherwise, like, the baseline mechanics are not the most exciting thing.
So here's my question. I think Bone Splitter has a fairly narrow application where it fits in a lot of environments, just in the most aggressive decks. Although it lets you trade up with tokens and stuff. Like, the card is just very powerful.
This is the kind of thing that, like, this is definitely, what you're saying is definitely what I've heard from people. Mm-hmm. That not only is Bone Splitter only an aggro card, but it's also only a card for, like, specific kinds of aggro decks. I've heard people say it's only for mono-colored aggro. And once you get into, like, 2-colored aggro or zoo or whatever you want to call it, you don't want Bone Splitter anymore. And I just don't know about any of that, because the raw damage output is good. I want this in any deck where I am expecting to be the aggressor, and that includes a mid-range deck against my controlling opponent. Well, specifically Bone Splitter is kind of challenging there because you don't really want to equip it against your controlling opponent because it makes their removal a little bit better if they time it just right. But there's so many decks where for the mana you get, the damage output is just so good that I think it's actually more broadly playable than perhaps people imply when they talk about it, just because it is at its, like, peak best of the best in, like, a dedicated monocolored aggro deck. Doesn't mean that it all of a sudden becomes unplayable in anything else.
Yeah, I mean, if we go further afield and talk about, for example, my regular cube, which is much lower power, if Bone Splitter was in that cube, you would put that in a huge range of decks, because just
every deck.
Putting it on a token and attacking and, forcing bad trades all day is a very viable strategy. My question is, if we do, let's take that starting point, assume that Bone Splitter mostly in a range of cubes fits in aggressive decks. Does this have more application to fit into other kinds of decks because it has this sort of long game build up this really powerful sword?
Realistically,
story?
I think no.
Okay.
I think realistically,
can you just lie a little bit?
No, I mean, if you want my real evaluation, I think the number of games where this is going to play differently than Bone Splitter is pretty small, and I think in my cube and cubes like it, half the time it's going to be worse because it exiled the thing you wanted to recur, or didn't fuel Delve, and half the time it's going to be better because you're going to give First Strike or something to a creature that wouldn't have First Strike.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's just going to be there wasn't a way to recur that creature, and it didn't have any abilities, so it's
that's
going to
be the most common way I think that it's going to actually play out. But that's not to discount this is similar to the Mana War bouncing your own creature thing, right?
The long tail is where the fun stuff is.
The long tail is where the fun stuff is. So if it's only 5 or 10% of the time that big block of text matters, and you're okay having cards with lots of text that doesn't always matter in your cube, then it's going to create really interesting and cool moments when it actually does come up.
Here's something we haven't considered, which is like the three of us are, very design oriented and very
smart, very cool, very sexual. Yeah, we're very
absolutely. Good. But we're also very focused on like this cost as a cube designer. But I wonder if part of the reason it's popular is because certain drafters will take one look at this and it will just be the thing that they draft around. Kind of like original Nicol Bolas or something in a pack. Like you just see it and the potential just, hits you in the face. And that becomes what your draft is about. I can see a lot of players really loving the aspirational quality of this card over against something like Bone Splitter, which is just raw efficiency with no pretensions.
It's not cool. We can just say it's not
greater.
Cool. It's fine.
Yeah, it is cool.
I do think, similar to what you said, Parker, I do think that having watched people draft my cube and listened very carefully to the things they said, because I'm trying to learn what they think about when they're looking at packs, it's a new card that I guarantee people will take much more highly than Bone Splitter, even if when pressed they're like, yeah, it's basically the same or it's the same power level. People have played with Bone Splitter a lot. If someone's drafting my cube, that card has been in there, I think, since the very first iteration of my cube. So it's been in there for the entire 5 years my cube has existed. Some people have played that card a bunch of times and they're just like, yeah, I've done it. But what I haven't done is played this really cool glowing samurai sword. And so I'm going to do that instead. And that is a valid reason to put a card in the cube. If it's just going to get that blood flowing again and make your drafters excited about playing the efficient 1 to cast, 1 to equip, 2+ power equipment, then that's a good enough reason.
I will say one detraction is just that it is a wall of text. I also think that there is an effect that players will open a card they haven't seen before in a pack and just say, this is literally too much text. I know that this card behind it in the pack is powerful. I'm just going to take that. So as much as I really value sort of that long tail of exciting moments, I think that the complexity here is a real negative. So I would always be trying to balance. And how do we get from the most understandable, readable cards, the most space in that exciting long tail?
I think most of that complexity collapses. Once you get to the phrase, the same is true for, you just glaze over that line and you reference it if you
shake
need
it out
to
when it happens.
The rest of the draft.
I think that's true. I do think it is important to draw distinctions between wordy cards that are really complicated and wordy cards where that complexity does kind of disappear a little bit if you give a little bit of effort to understanding it.
Right. It's not exactly... It's correlated, but it's not exactly the same thing to talk about how easy it is to comprehend a card and how complex it is and how wordy it is.
Yeah, because there are literally, Strixhaven Deans that have this much text on them that I have just never finished reading. Literally can't finish reading it. I'm like,
I'm bored. I don't want this card.
I just start getting there and I just can't do it. So I do think this card is different in that sense. For a quick point of reference, quick search on Cube Cobra suggests that Bone Splitter is played in 22% of all the cubes on Cube Cobra. Bone Splitter is a common, so it can see play in Pauper and Peasant cubes. And here, Eater of Virtue is being tested by 57% of all of our respondents.
That's a huge difference.
It's a big difference. And obviously, there's a lot of conflating factors there. We can't really just compare these numbers. And a lot of these people are probably by their own admission not going to be playing Eater of Virtue in 3 to 6, 9 months because they're going to get over it and do something else. But it's a big difference there. And I only bring it up because I'm going to make a similar comparison on our very last card as well, which is Lion Sash. 1 and a white for an artifact, creature, equipment, cat. These reconfigured cards have really scored very highly on the survey, it has to be noted. If we're looking through the top 16, a lot of reconfigured cards made the list.
I'm excited to see that. Often the new mechanics people are a little more skeptical of.
Yeah. This is a 1/1. It has an activated ability. For a white mana, you may exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and reconfigure for 2 generic mana. The obvious comparison here is to Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze, according to Cube Cobra, played in 26.64% of cubes, which I have to admit, if you would have asked me before I sat down and looked these 2 cards up, I would have guessed for sure that Bone Splitter was played in more cubes than Scavenging Ooze. It's a lower rarity, so it can be played in rarity-restricted cubes that Scavenging Ooze cannot. It's kind of more generically powerful, where Scavenging Ooze, I think most people are not excited to put this in a cube until their cube cares about the graveyard in some way, because otherwise that ability kind of feels like flavor text or whatever. But Scavenging Ooze is a very popular card, frankly more popular than I thought. Almost 27% of all the cubes on Cube Cobra. And here we have 60% of our respondents, 59.2% of our respondents are trying out the Lion Sash with a high rank of 2.4. Parker, where are you at on the Lion Sash?
Well, I am more of a cat person, so an
ooze person?
Than an ooze person, or y'all
I think oozes are kind of fun guy adjacent, so I'll go with ooze.
Yeah, and you mentioned the good boy spirited companion, and I kept quiet there because I didn't want, mobs and pitchforks at my house.
You're allowed to not like dogs. It's fine. No one's going to judge you here.
Dogs will still like you more than cats like you.
I've decided I like Sadie, Andy.
That's good to hear. That warms my heart.
I'm like the Grinch. My heart expands a little bit every day. But to get back on topic, I like game pieces whose value and whose decisions evolve throughout the course of the game. This has maybe been a trend as we've discussed these cards, but I like when my decisions change because my cards are changing dynamically. And Lion Sash does that. It does that on a couple of different axes. It gets bigger, but then it also has this reconfigure axis where, like, sometimes it'll make my other creature into a game piece that, like, gets renewed attention and renewed sets of possibilities. So I think it's a really pleasing design. It synergizes with a lot of powerful cards, most notably Stoneforge Mystic. So I think it's quite appealing.
Jared's hot take.
When this card was first spoiled, I, like many others, thought it would be extremely strong. However, I was blown away by just how strong it was when I got to play with it at the pre-release. During multiple games, I got to grow it throughout the game, reconfigure it onto an attacker, and then take it off to have a blocker. Also, its interactions with board wipes to fall off and have a huge attacker that turn was incredibly relevant across multiple games. I can't wait to put this in my Power Max Cube, where it can also interact with cards like Stoneforge Mystic.
There's so much to love about this card. It does so many different things. It touches so many different zones and like interacts with a lot of different cards in ways that are very cool. And I do think that as a baseline, it's not crazy powerful. Like, I think there's a lot of cubes, there's a broad range of cubes this could see playing. Like, Anthony, is this way too good for the regular cube? I don't think so.
I think it is. I think this card is quite strong.
I think you have stronger cards in the regular cube, and you've made conscious decisions about where to put that strength, but I don't think this is like over the top crazy powerful. Like, if you asked me to rank the cards in terms of raw power level in this set, this wouldn't be my number one. I don't think it would be that close, frankly. I think it would be after every single land, probably, and quite a few other cards before I would get to Lion Sash. I just think that it is a very like satisfying design, and it ticks all the right boxes. It's in the color you most want this effect in. It just does all kinds of great stuff.
It's a very weird design. I'm actually very surprised to see this as the number one card. I think a lot of that really is just because of the comparison to Scavenging Ooze and how popular that is. And like you're saying, I think it is more on theme in white for a lot of what decks are trying to do in a lot of cubes. But it is a lot going on, and I don't quite get it seeing it here in the number one slot.
I'm not surprised to see it at the top. I think it makes sense. And I think it's going to be very potent, but not in a way that's going to be tilting. Like, it's hard to describe how... I wish I had better language to describe why some cards are like really good in a way that it's like frustrating and feels like you didn't have any opportunity to do anything. And cards like this where like it is going to be really good, but it asks a lot of mana of you. Like we talked about on our last episode, that it's always going to be behind curve. It's a 3 mana 2/2, a 2 mana 1/1, a 4 mana 3/3, or the equipment side is going to be a ton of mana investment to give a relatively paltry power toughness boost to a creature for the amount of mana you could be investing. I mean, compare this to, it's going to be what? 2 mana to cast. You have to exile 2 things, so 4 mana, then reconfigure. So 6 mana before you get the same power boost you get from an Eater of Virtue or Bone Splitter. So on all of these like axes, it is going to be, I think, behind curve for what a lot of cubes are doing. But the fact that it gives you this whole wide cornucopia of options is very satisfying and exciting, I think. Do you think I'm wrong? You think it's going to be the best card in the regular cube?
Maybe not the best card, but it would definitely be top 5. I think just all that flexibility and the fact that 10. the fact that you can both interact with different zones, you can put a bunch of counters on this and like spread out your mana in different ways, and the equip ability, just being able to move around your power, just I think really it would matter.
One small detail I do really like about this, which is a tiny thing, is that obviously it keeps the activated ability even when it's just an equipment, and I like the fact that you can equip it and then essentially like you've granted the creature the ability that you've granted the creature that it's equipped to that ability to now grow at instant speed.
So you just can't block it a lot of the times.
Right, which is true of Scavenging Ooze and true of Lion Sash, but now you can grant that ability to another creature where now the threat of activation of exiling more permanents will be a relevant thing in combat. It's a cool card. Real quick.
It is a cool card.
What's everyone's favorite art for the Lion Sash? I keep calling it the Lion Sash. That for some reason I want to say the in front of it. It's just Lion Sash.
Unlike every other card in this particular set, this one is not legendary.
It is not legendary. Probably couldn't just fit on the line, is my guess. I don't think it can fit on the lines. We have the regular Lion Sash. We have the regular art that's extended to be semi-borderless. And then we have this showcase Lion Sash art.
It's got to be the showcase, right? I mean, the extended sort of blurry art, that really doesn't do it for me.
I agree. That one's my least favorite. Parker, what's your favorite printing of this card?
Also showcase.
I think I'm going to go with the OG art on this one. I don't know why.
The original art that came out 15 seconds
the
before
the default, what else do you want to call the one that's not the showcase?
On Scryfall, sure.
I don't know. It just, I really like the art of the main one where it's this like statue with this kind of ethereal sash, I guess is what it is.
Yeah, it's a sash.
I was trying to call it something else, but it's right on the card. It's called a sash.
Have you seen the neon in foil? I think they're pretty cool.
I have not seen one of the neon showcase cards in foil yet, so maybe that will tip me over. We'll see. Honestly, you know what I'll do? I'll get one of each because I have 2 cubes I'm putting Lion Sash in, and it really irks me to own 2 identical copies of the same card. I'm always going to get a different printing of the second card if I can, and I'm putting it in 2 cubes. Is that weird?
No, I think that's the correct choice.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
I have like 6 brainstorms for a similar reason. None of them share an art.
Ulrich's hot take.
This is Editing Andy coming at you with a very special hot take that applies to a card that didn't make the top 16.
Yukatai Soul Ripper is a mech that can eat its pilot. This makes it the coolest card in the set, and arguably one of the coolest cards Wizards has designed in probably a decade, if not more. That aside, I think it's a really fun and interesting black aggro piece. We're talking about being able to swing on turn 3 for 5 with evasion, and it provides a nice little way to put to use those recursive black 1-drops, or other aggressive 1-drops that basically peter off come turn 3. It's got a lot of ness about it too, but I think it deserves more attention and love from folks. Okay, bye.
That's it. We did, boys. That's the top 16 cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I think this set rules. I got to say, I think this set is a really great candidate for a set cube. It's one of the first times in a long time I've played a set in Retail Limited and just thought about the long tail of other Magic cards from other sets that would interact with the core mechanics of this particular plane, and just really wanted to build a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty themed cube, not just using cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, but using cards from all of Magic's history to bolster and extend these themes even further.
Yeah, we talked about in a previous episode how I was really excited that unlike a lot of standard sets, just about every mechanic here is really flexible and interacts with a ton of other stuff from the history of Magic, making this a great set for Cube because all these cards can just fit in lots of different places, and that's very cool. All that being said, then when I went back and looked at my cubes that I currently have together, I didn't find as many cards that I wanted to put in as I thought. And so what I realized is, well, these are very flexible, powerful, interesting mechanics, and I don't have a place for them yet, so I'm just going to have to make another cube.
There you go. Any parting thoughts, Parker? Parker's parting thoughts?
I just have to have a huge encore to what y'all said. I really have enjoyed playing this set in Retail Limited. I love every marquee mechanic in this set from a game design perspective. I love how the synergies emerge out of those mechanics instead of being, highly prescriptive or whatever. It reminds me of my favorite mechanics of all time, including Delirium and Revolt, which are just highly flexible, and everything in Neon Dynasty works in that way. So I love it. independently, and I'm also really excited to see which of these really cool, really appealing, fun, flavorful designs I can include in my own cubes.
It also must be said, I saw someone crunch the numbers, and Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is the wordiest set in Magic history. The most words in the set on the cards. I'm not feeling it, though, and it seems like a lot of other people aren't feeling it. I saw a lot of similar griping like we've done in this show about Kaldheim and Strixhaven in terms of the complexity of cards, and I think here they've done a good job in a lot of cases collapsing that complexity and making more resonant designs where the rules text is easier to parse, even though there is still a lot of it. All right, we kept it to a tight, 103, which is close to a tight 90. We got there. So there's some editing to be done there. We'll see how long the actual thing ends up being. Thank you all for tuning in to our set review show. Go to the website, check out the set review article that Parker will have written by the time this episode comes out. And,
I do think we should bookend and just really re-emphasize that we talked about a small chunk of the set. These
absolutely
aren't the best cards for Cube. These are just the cards that are best for the most cubes based on the survey. So
the cards that people think
out
are the best for most cubes.
Exactly.
But as the retrospective shows, people oftentimes think wrong about their own environments.
So I definitely encourage you to go check out the full list where you can, filter by rarity, see things that are tested by the most people versus the highest rated versus the most contentious, and hopefully that can be helpful looking back on the whole set.
Yeah, check out the full article. We only touched the tip of the iceberg here. But that's it for this episode. We got to go to bed now. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by calling up Parker on Parker's Zoom because we don't have a paid Zoom account because we're scrubs, and talking about the cards from the new set. Thank you for joining us, Parker. It is always a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Have a good night.
I feel like I should disclose to people that Parker requires the least editing in post-production relative to me, you, any other guest we've ever had. Parker just doesn't use a lot of filler words, doesn't say a lot of wrong things, takes his time. Very well-spoken man.
When in college, I was in Toastmasters, which was normally it's a really dry, boring business society, but it was a bunch of college-aged people, and so we had a good time with it. And they would ding this bell every time you said or ah, and the risk of social ostracization and embarrassment was enough to change a lot of habits for a lot of people.
I am not sure I could give a speech with someone dinging a bell every time I use a filler word
sounds
because
traumatizing.
It would. I'm very sensitive to noise, and I think it would really bother me, and I would just end up having a small meltdown if someone was ringing a bell every time I did something specific. So
yeah, you just got to get good, and then it's
get good, scrub. Get good, scrub. Let's do one more. One more gain.
Okay.
You don't need this on. I guess you're not listening to anything right now.
That's true.
Sadie, you have to be quiet. We're recording.
Sadie,
stop clicky-clacking around.
Go to bed. Not this bed, that bed. Sadie, go to bed.
She's fine.
Go to bed. Okay, whatever.
She faked you out. Actually, she was going to come on up.
I'm trying to record.
Just be quiet here.